Along the unmarked border between Kansas Territory and Missouri, a rancher's decision would transform his isolated homestead into the center of one of the most disturbing episodes in American frontier history. What started as a simple act of Christian mercy, offering water to a desperate fugitive, ended with his property surrounded by 300 souls, each carrying secrets that could shatter everything the nation believed about itself. The incident was buried so completely by local authorities that no official record exists. Yet whispers of what happened in those 48 hours have persisted for over a century and a half. Tonight, you'll hear the full account, pieced together from private letters, confiscated journals, and testimony never meant to see daylight. Before we continue with the story of the rancher who faced an impossible moral choice at the edge of civilization, I need to ask you something. This channel brings you the darkest corners of American history, stories that have been hidden, forgotten, or deliberately erased. If you value uncovering these buried truths, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. And I'm curious, where are you listening from right now? Drop your state or city in the comments below. Now, let's return to that fateful morning when everything changed. The spring of 1857 found Thomas Harland struggling to maintain his 160-acre claim in the borderlands where Kansas Territory met western Missouri. The land itself seemed determined to reject human settlement, rocky soil that broke plows, winters that killed livestock, summers that baked the earth into something harder than brick. Harland had come west 3 years earlier from Ohio, drawn by promises of cheap land and freedom from the increasingly bitter arguments over slavery that had turned his hometown into a battlefield of rhetoric and occasional violence. He was a slight man, barely 5.5 feet tall, with the kind of wiry frame that suggested endurance rather than strength. At 32, his face already carried deep lines around his eyes from squinting against the relentless prairie sun. He'd chosen this particular plot precisely because of its isolation, nearly 18 miles from the nearest settlement, a ramshackle collection of buildings that optimistically called itself Zephyr Crossing. His closest neighbor was the Gaines family, 7 miles to the northeast, and even they only visited twice a year. Harland wasn't running from the law or fleeing debt. He was running from complexity itself. The slavery question had torn his family apart, his father a fervent abolitionist, his uncle a Democrat who believed in state sovereignty above all else. Their arguments had grown so venomous that his mother had stopped hosting Sunday dinners. Harland wanted no part of any of it. He'd chosen neutrality, chosen silence, chosen the kind of isolation where a man could work his land without having to take a position on anything beyond when to plant and when to harvest. His homestead consisted of a single-room cabin built partially into a hillside for insulation, a lean-to that served as a barn, a root cellar, and a well he'd dug himself over 2 backbreaking months. He kept 4 chickens, 2 pigs, and a mule named Constance, who seemed to share his preference for solitude. The isolation suited him. Days would pass without him speaking aloud except to the animals. The morning of May 13th started like any other. Harland rose before dawn, fed the livestock, checked his meager vegetable garden where shoots of corn and beans were just beginning to emerge. The spring had been wetter than usual, which meant the creek along the southern edge of his property ran high and fast, its banks swollen with muddy water. He'd spent the previous day reinforcing the crude bridge he'd built, worried the whole structure might wash away. Around mid-morning, as he repaired a section of fence damaged by the pigs, he noticed something unusual on the western horizon, a figure moving slowly across the open prairie. This itself wasn't entirely remarkable. Travelers occasionally passed through, usually heading west toward newer settlements, sometimes east toward Missouri proper. What made him pause was the figure's size and the peculiar stumbling quality of their movement. As the shape drew closer over the next hour, Harland realized with a mixture of fascination and discomfort that he was watching a woman of extraordinary proportions, not fat, but tall, remarkably, almost impossibly tall. Even from several hundred yards, he could see she stood head and shoulders above what any normal person should. She moved like someone at the absolute limit of their endurance, each step requiring visible effort. She was heading directly toward his homestead. Harland stood frozen at his fence line, hammer in hand, watching her approach. In that moment, he understood immediately what she was, even before he could make out the details. The borderlands were a conduit for runaways, though most had the sense to travel by night and avoid isolated homesteads. This woman was moving in broad daylight, which meant she was either desperate, lost, or both. As she came within 100 yards, he could see her more clearly. She was indeed enormous. He would later estimate her height at nearly 7 feet, though terror and wonder might have inflated his guess. Her dress, if it could still be called that, was little more than rags held together by hope and momentum. Her feet were bare and bleeding, leaving small dark marks on the dry grass. Her skin was so dark it seemed to absorb the sunlight, and her face carried an expression of such focused determination that it bordered on frightening. She stopped at the edge of his property, swaying slightly, and their eyes met across the distance. For a long moment, neither moved. Harlan's mind raced through his options. He could pretend he hadn't seen her, retreat into his cabin, and let her pass. He could fire a warning shot, drive her away from his land. He could ride to Zephyr Crossing and report her presence to the part-time marshal who also ran the general store. Or he could acknowledge her humanity. "Water," she said, and her voice carried across the space between them with surprising clarity. Not a question, not a plea, simply a statement of what she needed to continue existing. Harlan found himself walking toward his well before he'd consciously made the decision. His hands trembled as he worked the rope, bringing up the bucket. She approached slowly, each step deliberate, and he could hear her breathing, harsh, ragged, the sound of someone who'd been running for days. When she reached the well, she didn't grab the dipper he offered. Instead, she waited, eyes locked on his face as if testing whether this was some kind of trap. Finally, she took the dipper, drank deeply, then drank again and again. She emptied the bucket twice before stepping back. "Thank you," she said, and there was something in her voice that made Harlan's skin prickle, not gratitude exactly, more like acknowledgement of a debt that would be repaid one way or another. "You should keep moving," he said quietly, surprised at the steadiness in his own voice. Before dark. They patrol the roads at night, but not the open country. She studied him for a long moment, and he had the unsettling sense of being evaluated, judged, and found adequate, perhaps, or useful. "My name is Delilah," she said. "I won't forget this." Then she turned and walked south toward the creek and the thick line of cottonwoods that marked its path. Harlan watched until she disappeared into the tree-line, then returned to his fence work with hands that wouldn't quite stop shaking. He told himself that was the end of it. One small act of mercy in a world that seemed increasingly short on such things. He would never see her again, and in a few weeks he'd wonder if he'd imagined the whole encounter. But as the sun began to set that evening, as he was securing the chickens for the night, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. There were footprints around his cabin. Many footprints, far too many, and they were fresh. Harlan didn't sleep that night. He sat in his cabin with his father's old rifle across his knees, watching the darkness beyond his single window. Every sound made him flinch, the wind moving through the grass, an owl calling from the cottonwoods, the pigs shifting in their lean-to. But beneath those ordinary night sounds, he thought he heard something else. Movement. Many somethings moving. Dawn came slowly, the darkness bleeding away to reveal a sight that would be burned into Harlan's memory for the rest of his life. They surrounded his property in a loose circle that extended perhaps 100 yards out from his cabin in all directions. Men, women, children. He counted frantically, losing track, starting over. 200, 250, 300, maybe more. All of them dark-skinned, all dressed in the remnants of slave clothing or crude substitutes fashioned from whatever they'd managed to steal or salvage during their flight north. But it was their silence that frightened him most. 300 people should make noise, talking, crying, arguing. These souls stood in complete silence, watching his cabin with expressions that ranged from desperate hope to something harder, more dangerous. They didn't advance. They didn't retreat. They simply waited. In the center of the group, towering over everyone else, stood Delilah. In the morning light, she looked even more imposing than she had the previous day. Her height gave her a quality that seemed almost biblical, like something from the Old Testament stories his mother used to read. She raised one arm, pointing directly at Harlan's cabin, and the gesture had the weight of prophecy. Harlan pushed open his cabin door, the hinges screaming in protest. The sound seemed obscenely loud in the pervasive silence. He stepped outside, rifle in hand but pointed at the ground, and the hundreds of eyes tracking his movement made his skin crawl. "What do you want?" he called out, his voice cracking on the last word. Delilah took 3 steps forward. Even just 3 steps with her stride brought her significantly closer. "You gave me water," she said. "You gave me mercy when you could have turned me in, collected whatever bounty they're offering for my return. That tells me something about your character." "I just gave you water," Harlan said, hearing the desperation in his own voice. That's all. I'm not part of any railway. I don't have resources. I can't help you. We're not asking you to help us move on, Delilah said, and something in her tone made Harlan's stomach clench. We're asking you to help us stay. The words hung in the air. Impossible. Absurd. 300 people couldn't simply stay in the middle of the Kansas prairie. They would be visible for miles. Slave catchers combed these territories constantly, sometimes legal authorities enforcing the Fugitive Slave Act, sometimes freelance hunters looking for bounties, sometimes owners themselves pursuing their property across state lines. That's insane, Harlan said. You'd be caught in days. Hours maybe. The patrols. The patrols don't come out here, Delilah interrupted. You chose this land because it's isolated. No roads nearby, no settlements. The kind of place where a man can disappear if he wants to. The kind of place where 300 people might disappear, too, if they're careful. A woman stepped forward from the group, older, perhaps 50, with gray threading through her hair and scars on her arms that suggested a lifetime of hard labor. We've been traveling for 6 weeks, she said, her voice carrying surprising strength. Started as 12 families who escaped from 3 different plantations in northern Missouri. Others joined us along the way. Every farm we passed, every work gang we saw, people slipped away in the night and followed. We didn't plan to become so many. It just happened. A man spoke up, young, maybe 20, with burns on his neck that looked like someone had extinguished cigars on his skin. We can't cross into free territory like this, too many of us. The authorities would stop us at any checkpoint, legal or not. But out here in the empty spaces, if we can just wait until the active hunting dies down. What makes you think I won't turn you in? Harlan asked, though even as he said it, he knew he wouldn't. He should. The Fugitive Slave Act made it a federal crime to harbor runaways. He could be fined $1,000, more money than he'd see in 10 lifetimes, or imprisoned. His property could be seized, his name ruined. But he wouldn't turn them in. Delilah seemed to read this in his face. Because you're a man who left civilization to escape hard choices, she said softly. But hard choices find us anyway, don't they? And when they do, we discover what we really are. The sun climbed higher, and still the 300 stood in their silent circle. Harlan could see children among them now, babies being held, toddlers clinging to their mother's skirts, older children with eyes that had seen too much. An elderly man leaning heavily on a walking stick. A pregnant woman, her belly swollen with the promise of life that would be born into either freedom or bondage, depending on what happened in the next few days. How long? Harlan finally asked. How long would you need to stay? Delilah's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her posture. Relief, perhaps, or the release of tension she'd been holding since she first approached as well. There's a conductor coming through in 2 weeks. Moses, they call her. She has a route that can handle large groups, but she only comes through this area twice a year. We missed her last passage by 3 days. She's our only chance to move this many people safely. 2 weeks. 14 days of hiding 300 people in the middle of open prairie where a single patrol could spell disaster for everyone involved. There are caves, Harlan heard himself say. About a mile south along the creek. The banks are high there, lots of overgrowth. In the spring flood 2 years ago, I explored them. Large chambers, some going back pretty deep into the hillside. It's not comfortable. But we're not looking for comfortable, the older woman said. We're looking for invisible. And so it began. The strangest, most terrifying 2 weeks of Thomas Harlan's life. A period that would test everything he believed about himself and reveal capacities for both courage and horror he'd never imagined possessing. The logistics of hiding 300 people proved far more complex than Harlan had imagined during that first impulsive offer. The caves he'd mentioned could shelter perhaps 100 at most, and only if people were willing to pack in tightly, endure darkness and dampness, and the sound of the creek rushing past just outside. The rest would need to scatter through the heavy brush along the waterway, creating makeshift shelters from branches and whatever fabric they could spare. But before any of that could happen, they needed to erase evidence of their presence. Delilah proved herself a natural organizer. She divided the group into work details with calm efficiency. One team focused on smoothing out the grass where hundreds of feet had trampled it, using branches to rake the prairie back into something resembling its natural state. Another group collected every scrap of evidence that people had passed through, discarded rags, lost buttons, anything that might catch a patrol's eye. Harland watched them work with a mixture of awe and growing dread. These people moved with the practiced efficiency of those who'd spent their entire lives working under supervision, following orders, accomplishing impossible tasks because the alternative was punishment. But now they were working for themselves, for their own survival. And the difference showed in the intensity of their effort. The young man with the cigar burns on his neck introduced himself as Nathan. He'd been owned by a tobacco planter in Clay County, Missouri, trained as a blacksmith but rented out to various farms and businesses. "My owner liked to remind me who controlled my body," he said quietly, touching the scars. "Used me as an ashtray when he was drinking. Told me I should be grateful. He could have sold me south to the cotton plantations where they worked men to death in 5 years. He'd escaped on a moonless night in late March, killing the dogs his owner had sent after him with his own hands. I didn't want to do it," he said. "Those dogs didn't choose their masters any more than I did. But it was them or me, and I chose me." The older woman's name was Ruth, and she'd been enslaved on a hemp plantation in Lafayette County. She'd given birth to 11 children, watched 8 of them sold away before they reached age 10. The 3 who remained had escaped with her, along with her husband Samuel, who'd lost 3 fingers on his left hand to a corn sheller accident that his owner had refused to get treated properly. The wounds had healed badly, leaving him with a claw-like hand that he wielded with surprising dexterity. Every person had a story. Every story contained cruelty that made Harland's stomach turn. A woman named Charity had been bred like livestock, forced to bear children for 5 different men her owner selected to improve the stock. A man called simply Big James had scars across his entire back from whipping so severe they'd exposed bone. A teenage girl named Sarah had burn marks in the shape of her owner's initials branded into her shoulder. But it was Delilah's story that truly shook Harland to his core. She'd been born on a plantation in Kentucky, daughter of a woman who'd been tall herself, nearly 6 feet, and a father who'd been selected specifically for his size and strength. "They bred us like horses," she said flatly, sitting by Harland's fire the second night. "Looking for the biggest, strongest workers. My mother gave birth to 4 children. I was the only one who survived past age 5. The others just grew too fast. Their hearts couldn't keep up with their bodies." By age 14, Delilah had reached 6 feet tall. By 16, she'd topped 6.5 feet. Her owner had been delighted at first, seeing her as proof that his breeding program worked. He'd hired her out to other plantations for stud service, forcing her to bear children with men selected for their size and strength. "I had 7 pregnancies," she said, staring into the fire. 6 children born. Only 2 survived past infancy. My body was too big to properly nourish them while I was still forced to work full days in the fields. My last baby, a boy, died in my arms 3 days after birth. Just stopped breathing. And I felt something break inside me that day, something that told me I would rather die than continue living as property." She'd been planning her escape for 2 years, carefully cultivating a reputation for being slow-witted and obedient while secretly hoarding food, studying patrol patterns, and learning which other enslaved people might be willing to run if given the chance. When she'd finally fled, 12 people had come with her. By the time she reached Harland's property, that 12 had grown to 300, a rolling wave of humanity collecting desperate souls as it moved. "I didn't set out to lead anyone," she said. "But when you're 7 feet tall and you're the one walking in front, people assume you know where you're going. So I started acting like I did." The days developed a terrifying routine. Before dawn, Harland would scout the surrounding area, climbing to a high point where he could see for miles in every direction. If the horizon was clear, he'd signal the hidden refugees, a white cloth hung from a specific fence post, that it was safe to emerge for a few hours to stretch cramped limbs, to care for sanitary needs in a more dignified fashion than the caves allowed, to let the children run and release some of their pent-up energy. But everyone remained constantly alert for danger. Nathan had organized watch teams that rotated every 2 hours, young men with good eyesight who positioned themselves at strategic points with instructions to give warning at the first sign of riders. The signal was simple but effective, a morning dove call, specific and distinctive. Food became the pressing concern. Harland's stores couldn't possibly feed 300 people for 2 weeks. He slaughtered both pigs and the chickens too, though he mourned the loss of his egg supply. Several of the men went out at night to hunt, taking terrible risks but returning with rabbits, wild turkeys, even a small deer. The women organized careful rationing, making sure the children and elderly ate first, then nursing mothers, then everyone else. Water was less of a problem thanks to the creek, though Harlan worried constantly about the risk of disease from so many people drawing from the same source. Ruth, who had extensive knowledge of medicinal plants, organized teams to collect herbs and roots she could use to treat the inevitable illnesses that began to appear. A child developed a terrible cough that wouldn't break. An elderly man's leg wound from the journey turned septic, and Ruth worked for 3 days to save the limb, finally succeeding through some combination of poultices and prayer. Harlan found himself drawn into their community despite his instinct for isolation. He'd spent 3 years avoiding human connection, and now he was surrounded by hundreds of people whose lives depended on his continued silence and support. It should have been suffocating. Instead, he found himself sitting around their carefully concealed fires at night, listening to their stories, sharing his own more limited experiences. The children were simultaneously the greatest joy and the deepest source of anxiety. Despite their circumstances, they found ways to play, creating games from nothing, laughing in ways that terrified the adults who constantly had to shush them. One little girl, maybe 4 years old, attached herself to Harlan, following him around during the safe hours, asking endless questions about his mule, his cabin, the prairie itself. Her name was Lily, and she'd been born into slavery in Missouri, just like her parents. She had no concept of freedom, didn't understand what they were running toward, only that everyone seemed frightened and hopeful in equal measure. When Harlan asked her what she wanted to be when she grew up, she looked at him with confusion, as if the question made no sense. "I'll be what my master tells me to be," she said simply, and Harlan had to turn away before she could see the tears in his eyes. 1 week passed, then 10 days. The constant tension began to wear on everyone. Tempers grew short. Arguments broke out over trivial matters, the distribution of food, the rotation of cave space, whether children should be allowed to play outside the shelters even during safe hours. Delilah mediated most disputes with a combination of common sense and sheer physical presence. When she said a matter was settled, people generally accepted it. But on the 11th night, something happened that nearly destroyed everything they'd built. The patrol came from the east, following the creek bed in a direction Harlan hadn't anticipated. 4 riders moving slowly through the darkness, clearly searching for something specific. Nathan spotted them first and gave the dove call, and 300 people melted into the landscape with practiced speed that spoke to generations of learning how to become invisible. Harlan stood by his cabin, forcing himself to breathe normally as the riders approached. He recognized one of them, a man named Cobb, who ran a freight business out of Zephyr Crossing and supplemented his income by hunting runaways for the bounties. The others were strangers, hard-faced men with rifles across their saddles and the look of people who'd turned cruelty into a profession. "Evening," Cobb called out, reining in his horse about 20 yards from Harlan's door. "Didn't expect to find anyone living way out here." "Been here 3 years," Harlan said, keeping his voice level. "Homestead claim. Haven't gotten around to filing all the proper papers yet, but the land's mine by right of improvement." Cobb nodded slowly, his eyes scanning Harlan's property with uncomfortable intensity. "You seen any colored folks come through here?" "Large group, maybe. We're tracking a bunch of runaways, probably 50 or so. Got word they were heading west toward the territory." 50. They thought they were hunting 50 people, not 300. Someone's intelligence was badly out of date, which meant the full scale of the escape hadn't been reported yet, probably because the various owners hadn't yet compared notes, hadn't realized their individual losses were part of a much larger exodus. "Haven't seen anyone," Harlan said. "Like you said, I'm pretty isolated out here. Don't get many visitors." One of the other riders, a man with a scarred face and cold eyes, kneed his horse forward. "Mind if we take a look around, just to be sure?" This was the moment Harlan had dreaded since the whole thing began. If they searched thoroughly, they'd find signs. Impossible not to. With 300 people living within a mile radius, trampled grass, hidden paths to the creek, evidence of fires, waste disposal, the simple wear and tear that many humans inevitably left on a landscape. "I do mind, actually," Harlan said, and saw Cobb's eyes narrow. "This is my property, legally claimed, and I've got rights. You have no authority to search without proper cause, and me telling you I haven't seen anyone should be sufficient." That's an interesting position to take, the scarred man said softly, for someone with nothing to hide. It's the position any freeman should take when faced with people trying to violate his property rights, Harland replied. We fought a revolution over this kind of thing, if memory serves. Cobb held up a hand, forestalling whatever his companion had been about to say. Now, let's all stay calm here. Mr. Harland. Thomas Harland. Mr. Harland, we're just doing our jobs. The Fugitive Slave Act makes it a federal crime to harbor runaways. We have legal authority to search any place we have reasonable suspicion. And what's your reasonable suspicion based on? That I happen to live in the general direction some slaves might have traveled. By that logic, you could search every property between here and Canada. The tension stretched out. 4 armed men facing one man with a rifle he deliberately left inside his cabin to avoid appearing threatening. Harland could feel sweat running down his spine despite the cool night air. If they decided to search anyway, he had no way to stop them. He could grab his rifle, try to hold them off, but that would just confirm their suspicions and bring more men with more guns. Somewhere in the darkness behind him, 300 people waited in silence, their lives hanging on this conversation. I'll make you a deal, Cobb finally said. You let us water our horses at your well, maybe rest here for a bit, and we'll consider your cooperation noted. Might be worth something later if questions come up about this area. It was a test. Harland realized they wanted to stay long enough to observe, to see if he showed signs of nervousness, if anyone tried to slip away in the darkness thinking the coast was clear. If he refused, he'd look suspicious. If he agreed, he'd have to maintain perfect composure while they watched for any crack in his facade. Well's over there, Harland said, gesturing. Water's cold and clean. Help yourselves. The next hour was the longest of Harland's life. The riders watered their horses slowly, all the while studying his property with eyes that missed nothing. Harland forced himself to go about normal business, checking on his mule, adjusting some equipment in the lean-to, even starting a fire and making coffee, which he felt obligated to offer the men, though the thought of sharing anything with them made his skin crawl. They talked among themselves in low voices, occasionally asking Harland casual questions that felt anything but casual. How long had he been alone out here? Where had he come from before? Did he keep up with politics? What did he think about Kansas joining the Union as a free state versus a slave state? Harland gave careful, neutral answers, playing the role of a man who deliberately removed himself from such controversies. It wasn't difficult. It was who he'd actually tried to be before 300 desperate souls had made neutrality impossible. Finally, after what felt like days but was probably only 60 or 70 minutes, Cobb stood and stretched. Well, Mr. Harland, we appreciate your hospitality. If you do happen to see any colored folks come through, there's good money in reporting them. Bounties range from $50 to $300, depending on the individual. That's a lot more than most men see in a year out here. I'll keep that in mind, Harland said evenly. They mounted up, and for one terrible moment, the scarred man turned his horse toward the south, toward the creek where the caves and shelters lay hidden in the darkness. Harland's heart hammered so hard he was certain they could hear it. But then Cobb called out, "This way, Davis. Let's check that settlement we passed yesterday," and the scarred man wheeled his horse around to follow. Harland watched them ride east until they disappeared into the darkness, then stood for another 30 minutes, making sure they weren't circling back. Only when he was certain they were truly gone did he give the all-clear signal, 3 short whistles like a nightjar. The dove call came back almost immediately, and gradually, cautiously, the hidden refugees began to emerge. Delilah was the first to reach him, moving with surprising silence for someone so large. "That was too close," she said quietly. "They thought they were tracking 50 people," Harland said. "Which means whatever's happening is bigger than individual owners chasing their property. The different escapes haven't been connected yet," Delilah finished. "But they will be. And when they are, we need to be gone," Harland said. "How much longer until your conductor arrives?" 3 days, Delilah replied. "If she stays on schedule. If she hasn't been caught or delayed." "If," Delilah repeated, and the word carried the weight of every uncertainty they faced. But the close call with the patrol had shaken something loose in the group's fragile cohesion. That night, as people tried to settle back into their hiding places, Harland overheard fragments of worried conversations. Some people wanted to split up, arguing that a group this large was impossible to hide and would be easier to manage as smaller units. Others insisted that staying together was their only strength, that separating would leave individuals vulnerable to being picked off one by one. The debate came to a head the following morning when a man named Josiah stood up during one of the brief open periods and addressed Delilah directly. "You brought us here," he said, his voice carrying across the assembled group. "You told us this was the way to freedom, but every day we stay in one place is another day we risk being caught. I say we should move on, take our chances heading west on our own." Delilah regarded him with an expression that gave nothing away. "And where exactly would you go?" "Kansas Territory has free state supporters," Josiah argued. "Lawrence, Topeka, places where abolitionists would shelter us. Kansas Territory also has pro-slavery raiders who would turn us in for the bounties," Ruth interjected. "Bleeding Kansas, they call it, because both sides have been killing each other for 2 years over whether it'll be slave or free. You think we'd be safe walking into that? Safer than sitting here waiting to be discovered?" Josiah shot back. "We've come this far together," Nathan said quietly. 300 people all the way from Missouri. That has to mean something. We split up now, we lose our greatest strength." "What strength?" Josiah demanded. "We're just a big target. The bigger the group, the easier to spot." "The bigger the group, the harder to capture," Big James rumbled. He stood up, his massive frame making even Delilah look almost normal-sized in comparison. "You ever tried to control a crowd of angry people?" "I have. Worked on a plantation where they tried to break up a gathering of 50 souls who wanted better food. Took them 20 armed overseers, and they still barely managed it. Now imagine what 300 people could do if we decided to stop running and start fighting." The suggestion hung in the air, dangerous and tempting. Harland saw it ripple through the crowd, the possibility of resistance, of turning and facing their pursuers rather than continuing to hide. It terrified him, not because he thought it was wrong, but because he could see how easily terror and desperation could tip into violence. "No," Delilah said firmly. "We didn't come all this way to become what they've made us out to be, violent, savage, dangerous. We survive by being smarter, not by fighting battles we can win." "But we could win," Josiah insisted. 300 of us against however many slave catchers they send. We have numbers." "Numbers aren't enough," Ruth said quietly. "They have guns, training, the law on their side. We fight, we die. Maybe we take some of them with us, but we still die. And even if by some miracle we won, then what? We'd be fugitives and murderers, every authority in the territory would be hunting us. Is that the freedom you want?" The tension in the group was palpable, and Harland realized with growing alarm that they were teetering on the edge of fracture. If the group split, if people started leaving in different directions, it would only be a matter of time before someone was caught. And once captured, they'd be interrogated, tortured, probably made to reveal where the others were hiding. 3 more days, Harland heard himself say, and everyone turned to look at him. He'd been so careful to stay on the periphery of their debates, to not insert himself into their decisions. But he couldn't stay silent now. "The conductor is due in 3 days. If she doesn't come, then you make your choices. But give it 3 more days. You've made it this far. Don't fall apart when you're so close." Delilah gave him a look of something that might have been gratitude or might have been calculation. "The man has a point. We've survived 11 days. We can survive 3 more. The group eventually dispersed back to their hiding places, but the argument had left cracks in the solidarity that had carried them this far. Harland could feel it, the way people clustered in smaller groups now, the suspicious glances, the whispered conversations that stopped when others approached. That night, as he lay in his cabin staring at the ceiling, Harland tried to calculate how many laws he'd already broken. Harboring fugitive slaves was a federal crime carrying a $1,000 fine. Providing material support, food, shelter, aid, compounded the offense. If authorities discovered what he'd done, he could be imprisoned, his property seized, his name destroyed. And yet, when he thought about turning them in, about collecting the bounties that would make him wealthy beyond his dreams, the idea filled him with such self-loathing that he physically couldn't entertain it. He'd come west to escape hard choices. Instead, he'd found the hardest choice of all, whether to preserve his own safety or risk everything for people he'd never met before. As dawn broke on day 12, Harland had his answer. He'd already made his choice, whether he'd consciously acknowledged it or not. The moment he'd given Delilah water, he'd committed himself to this path. All that remained was seeing it through to whatever end awaited them. Day 12 brought a development that sent ripples of barely contained panic through the hidden refugees. One of the scouts, a young man named Isaac who'd positioned himself on the high ground to the north, came running back to the encampment in broad daylight, breaking every protocol about remaining hidden during sunup hours. "Riders," he gasped out. At least 20 of them, maybe more, coming from the east, spread out in a line like they're sweeping the territory. 20 riders meant a coordinated search party, not just a random patrol. It meant someone had put together enough clues to know a large group was in the area, even if they didn't know the exact numbers. Delilah's face went absolutely still. How far? Maybe 3 miles. Moving slow, checking every draw and creek bed. How long until they reach us? 2 hours. Maybe 3 if they stay thorough. The word sent the community into controlled chaos. People began gathering their few possessions, preparing to flee deeper into the landscape. But Ruth held up a hand, her voice cutting through the rising panic. "Wait," she said. "Think about this. 3 miles. That's not enough time to pack up and move 300 people without leaving a trail a blind man could follow. We run now in daylight, scattered and panicked, we might as well paint signs pointing to where we've gone. So what do you suggest?" Josiah demanded. "We just sit here and wait to be caught." "I suggest we make them think there's nothing here to find," Ruth replied. She turned to Harland. "Your property, how normal does it look right now?" Harland thought quickly. "I slaughtered my livestock for food. That's unusual. And my supplies are basically gone. If they search my cabin..." "Then we make sure they don't," Big James said. "We give them something else to look at. A reason to keep moving." Nathan's eyes lit up. "A decoy. We plant evidence of a group heading west, away from here. Fresh trail. Maybe some dropped items. Enough to make them think they're still behind their quarry." "It might work," Delilah said slowly. "If we can make it convincing enough." The next hour saw the most desperate piece of theater Harland had ever witnessed. A group of 20 volunteers led by Nathan set out to create a false trail heading northwest. They moved deliberately, trampling grass, breaking branches, even abandoning a few items that looked like they'd been dropped in haste, a torn shirt, a crude wooden toy, a tin cup. Meanwhile, everyone else worked to eliminate any trace of their presence. The fires were doused and scattered. Waste was buried deeper. The paths to and from the creek were carefully disguised. People retreated into the caves and the deepest brush, packing in so tightly that Harland could hardly believe 300 souls could fit in such a confined space. Harland himself worked frantically to restore his cabin and property to something resembling its pre-arrival state. He couldn't replace his livestock, but he could at least clean up the butchering area, distribute the remaining stores to make it look like he'd been living normally rather than feeding a small army. With 30 minutes to spare before the estimated arrival of the search party, everything that could be done was done. The refugees were hidden. The false trail was laid. Harland's property looked as close to normal as they could manage. Harland forced himself to engage in routine tasks as if this were any other day. He worked on his fence, the same fence he'd been repairing when Delilah first appeared. If anyone was watching from a distance, they'd see a man going about his business, not someone harboring hundreds of fugitives. The riders appeared on the eastern horizon right on schedule. Harland counted them carefully, 23 men, all armed, moving in a coordinated line that suggested military experience. Several wore the kind of hard-worn clothes that marked them as professional slave catchers. Others had the look of local men recruited for the hunt, farmers and merchants who saw easy money in capturing human beings. Leading them was a man Harland didn't recognize at first, tall, lean, with iron-gray hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. He rode with the confidence of someone accustomed to authority, and when he raised his hand to halt the line about 100 yards from Harland's cabin, the other riders stopped instantly. He spurred his horse forward, approaching alone. As he drew closer, Harland felt his stomach drop. He recognized the man now, Colonel Martin Grayson, a former military officer who'd made a fortune in the slave trade after leaving the army. Harland had seen his name in newspapers, always in connection with high-profile captures or the suppression of slave rebellions. This wasn't just a search party. This was a manhunt led by someone who treated it as warfare. "You the owner of this property?" Grayson's voice was clipped, military precise. "Thomas Harland. This is my homestead. Colonel Martin Grayson. I'm leading a federal operation to recover stolen property. We have reliable information that a large group of fugitive slaves passed through this area within the past 2 weeks. What can you tell me about that?" Harland kept his voice steady. "Already answered these questions for a patrol that came through a few days ago. Haven't seen any large groups. Haven't seen anyone at all except you." "What patrol?" "Men named Cobb out of Zephyr Crossing. 3 others with him." "Cobb," Grayson said the name like it tasted bad. "Local bounty hunter, not part of my operation." He dismounted, and Harland noticed how he moved economically, every motion purposeful. This was a man who'd spent his life in situations where wasted effort could mean death. "I'm going to be direct with you, Mr. Harland. We're not tracking a small group anymore. We've connected at least 9 separate escape incidents from 3 different counties in Missouri. We're looking at somewhere between 200 and 300 missing slaves, representing a total value of over $100,000. That's more than just property loss. That's economic warfare. 200 to 300. They knew. Or at least they suspected. That's a lot of people, Harland said carefully. Hard to imagine hiding that many in open country like this. Exactly what I thought, Grayson said, until I started tracing the route. They're staying off the main paths, avoiding settlements, moving through the empty spaces. Your property is exactly the kind of empty space they'd seek out, isolated, no neighbors. Perfect place to rest and regroup. It's also perfect for someone who wants to be left alone, Harland countered. Which is why I'm here. I came west to escape politics and controversies. Finding myself in the middle of one wasn't part of the plan. Grayson studied him for a long moment. You mind if I search your property? I'd prefer you didn't. That's not a no. It's an expression of my rights as a landowner, Harland said. You want to search? Show me a warrant signed by a federal judge. The Fugitive Slave Act gives me authority. To search when you have probable cause, Harland interrupted. My saying I haven't seen anyone isn't probable cause. It's the opposite of probable cause. Behind Grayson, the line of riders had been spreading out, and Harland realized with cold certainty that this conversation was partially a distraction. They were positioning themselves to search whether he consented or not. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in the Kansas borderlands intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. Grayson seemed to come to a decision. Here's what's going to happen, Mr. Harland. My men are going to conduct a thorough search of this area. You can cooperate and possibly earn yourself some consideration if questions arise later, or you can obstruct and guarantee that you'll face federal charges. Your choice. Before Harland could respond, one of the riders called out, Colonel. Fresh trail here heading northwest. Grayson's attention snapped toward the voice. Show me. They rode toward the false trail Nathan's group had laid, and Harland forced himself to stay calm, to keep working on his fence, as if the outcome of this search didn't determine the fate of 300 human beings. He could see several riders dismounting, studying the ground, pointing out details to Grayson. The conversation carried across the distance, fragments reaching Harland's ears. Definitely recent, at least 20, maybe 30 in this group, heading toward the Kansas River Valley. One of Grayson's lieutenants rode back to the main group. Colonel's orders. We're following this trail. Looks like they've only got a few hours lead on us. The relief that flooded through Harland was so intense it left him lightheaded. They were taking the bait. They were leaving. But then Grayson himself rode back, and something in his expression made Harland's relief evaporate. I'm leaving half my men here, Grayson said quietly, to search this property thoroughly while I pursue that trail. Because something doesn't sit right with me, Mr. Harland. A trail that convenient, appearing exactly when we show up, that feels staged. I wouldn't know anything about that, Harland said, his mouth dry. "I'm sure you wouldn't." Grayson turned to address the men he was leaving behind. "Search every structure, every outbuilding, every cave, and draw within 2 miles. If you find evidence of recent large-scale habitation, send a rider to catch up with my group. If this property is clean, you can join us on the trail." He spurred his horse, and 12 riders followed him northwest. But 11 remained, spreading out across Harlan's property with rifles ready and eyes that missed nothing. The search began systematically. They started with Harlan's cabin, tearing through his meager possessions, checking under floorboards, examining every corner. They moved to the lean-to, then began working their way south toward the creek, toward the caves. Harlan stood frozen, calculating distances and time. The caves were perhaps 20 minutes' walk at a normal pace. The searchers were being thorough, which would slow them down, but not by much. An hour, maybe. Possibly 2 if they were extremely methodical. He had to warn the hidden refugees somehow. Had to give them a chance to scatter deeper into the landscape before the searchers reached them. But how could he do that without revealing his knowledge of their location? The answer came from an unexpected source. One of the searchers, a younger man who didn't have the hard edge of the professional slave catchers, approached Harlan as the others began moving toward the creek. "This must be difficult for you," the man said, "having your property invaded like this." "It's not pleasant," Harlan agreed carefully. "I'm Joseph Brennan. I own a dry goods store in Missouri. Got recruited for this because they needed numbers. To be honest, I'm not comfortable with the whole thing. These are people we're chasing, not animals." Harlan studied him, trying to determine if this was some kind of test. "Then why are you here?" "Because the law is the law," Brennan said, but his voice lacked conviction. "And because my business depends on staying in good standing with the local authorities. Sometimes you do things you're not proud of because the alternative is worse." "I understand that," Harlan said quietly. Brennan looked toward the creek where the other searchers were beginning to fan out. "If there were people hiding in those caves, they'd hear us coming from pretty far off. The way voices carry along the water, the sound of horses, men talking, they'd have warning enough to slip away deeper into the landscape before we found any evidence." He said it casually, as if making an observation about nothing important. But his eyes met Harlan's with deliberate meaning. "I imagine that's true," Harlan said carefully. "Sound does carry along the creek. Especially if someone was to say, fire a rifle shot. Signal they were hunting. That would carry a long way. Give anyone in the area plenty of warning to clear out." They stared at each other for a long moment. "I should probably check my property line to the west," Harlan said slowly. "Make sure none of your people accidentally cross onto my neighbor's land and cause a whole other territorial dispute." "That sounds wise," Brennan agreed. "And if you happen to spot any game while you're riding your property, well, a man's got to eat." Harlan saddled Constance and rode west at a measured pace, visible to anyone watching. When he'd gone far enough that a shot wouldn't seem to be directed at the searchers, he raised his rifle and fired into the air. The sound echoed across the prairie, rolling toward the creek where 300 people waited in darkness. A sound that meant danger. A sound that meant run. He fired twice more, spacing the shots to make it seem like he was tracking game. Then he turned Constance and rode back toward his cabin, his heart hammering so hard he could feel it in his throat. By the time he returned, the searchers had reached the caves. He could see them entering, torches held high, voices calling out as they explored the chambers. He forced himself to breathe normally, to show no reaction. They emerged an hour later, frustrated but empty-handed. "Nothing," one of them reported. "Some signs of animals denning in there, but no evidence of people." "Check the brush along the creek," another ordered. They could be hiding in the undergrowth. They searched until dark, finding only traces that could have meant anything, a broken branch, some trampled grass, ordinary signs of wildlife. No people. No definitive evidence of 300 souls having sheltered there for nearly 2 weeks. As night fell, the searchers finally gave up and prepared to ride out to join Grayson's group on the trail. Before leaving, their leader, a hard-faced man named Webb, stopped his horse next to where Harlan stood. "You're either the luckiest man in Kansas territory," Webb said quietly, "or the smartest. Either way, this isn't over. When they figure out the trail is a decoy, they'll be back. And next time, they won't be as polite about searching." Then they were gone, riding into the darkness, and Harland was alone on his property for the first time in 12 days. He waited an hour to be certain they were truly gone. Then he walked to the creek in the darkness and gave the all-clear signal. Nothing happened. He waited, called out softly. Still nothing. It took him another hour of searching before he finally found them. They'd scattered into the deepest parts of the landscape, hiding individually or in small family groups, spreading out so widely that no search party could possibly find them all. Slowly, cautiously, they regathered, not at the caves, those were too dangerous now, but in a dozen different locations along several miles of creek. The community that had been 300 strong was now fragmented into smaller units that could move independently if needed. Harland found Delilah with a group of about 40 people sheltering in a particularly dense thicket of undergrowth. "The warning shot," she said. "That was you." He nodded. "You saved us again." "Someone helped," Harland said, thinking of Brennan's careful words. "Not everyone hunting you believes in what they're doing." "But they're doing it anyway," Delilah said. "Which makes them just as dangerous as the true believers." She was right, and Harland knew it. Good intentions from men like Brennan didn't change the fact that they'd still capture and return human beings to slavery if given the chance. "One more day," he said. "The conductor is due tomorrow night. You just have to hold on for one more day." But even as he said it, Harland wondered if one more day would be enough. Grayson would realize the trail was false soon enough. And when he did, he'd be back with even more men and even more determination to find his stolen property. The endgame was approaching, and Harland had no idea if any of them would survive it. The 13th day dawned gray and cold, with clouds moving in from the west that promised rain by evening. Harland watched the weather with mixed feelings. Rain would help hide the refugees' presence, washing away scent trails and covering sounds, but it would also make travel more difficult, turning the prairie into sucking mud that would slow any escape attempt. He'd spent the night riding between the scattered groups, carrying messages from Delilah, trying to keep the fragmented community connected. They were stretched along almost 3 miles of creek now, broken into units small enough to hide effectively but large enough to provide mutual protection. The original plan of staying together until the conductor arrived had been abandoned. Now they'd gather only at the last moment when it was time to move. If the conductor actually came. Harland had been turning the doubt over in his mind constantly. He'd never met this Moses that Delilah spoke of with such reverence, didn't know her real name, her methods, whether she was even still alive. For all he knew, she'd been captured weeks ago, and Delilah's faith in her arrival was built on nothing but desperate hope. Around noon, as dark clouds continued to build in the west, Nathan arrived at Harland's cabin at a dead run. "They're back," he gasped out. Grayson and his men, coming from the northwest. They must have figured out the trail was a decoy. "How many?" "All of them. And they've picked up more. I counted at least 30 riders. Maybe more. 30 armed men against 300 unarmed refugees. Most of them women and children. It wouldn't even be a fight. It would be a roundup." "We need to scatter," Harland said. "Get as far from here as possible before they arrive." "Too late for that," Nathan replied. "They're less than a mile out, moving fast. They'll see anyone trying to run across open prairie." Harland's mind raced through options, rejecting each one as quickly as it formed. They couldn't hide. Grayson would search every inch of the landscape this time. They couldn't run, not in daylight with riders who could move 10 times faster. They couldn't fight. Actually, maybe they could. The thought emerged fully formed, terrible and compelling. 300 people cornered and desperate, facing men who saw them as property rather than human beings. It would be suicide for most of them, but for some, it might create enough chaos and confusion to allow escape. Delilah must have been thinking along similar lines. She appeared from the direction of the creek, moving with that distinctive loping stride that covered ground faster than seemed possible. Big James and Ruth were with her, along with about 50 others. "We can't all escape," she said without preamble. "Not from 30 armed riders. But some of us might if we create a diversion." "What kind of diversion?" Harland asked, though he already knew the answer. "The kind where some of us stand and fight while others run." "That's murder," Harland said. "They'll cut down anyone who resists." "They're going to capture us anyway," Big James rumbled. This way, at least some of us go free. The children. The pregnant women. The elderly who couldn't survive being dragged back in chains. The arithmetic was brutal but undeniable. Sacrifice the strong to save the weak. The old resistance mathematics that enslaved people had been forced to calculate for generations. There might be another way, a voice said. And they all turned to see Joseph Brennan standing at the edge of Harlan's property, the store owner who'd given Harlan the warning the previous day. He was alone, having apparently separated from the main search party. "What are you doing here?" Harlan demanded. "Trying to stop a massacre," Brennan replied. "Colonel Grayson is convinced you're harboring the fugitives, Mr. Harlan. He's planning to make an example, burn your property, have you arrested for federal crimes, and conduct a search so thorough that a field mouse couldn't escape detection. So you came to warn us before participating in our capture." Delilah's voice dripped with contempt. "I came to offer an alternative," Brennan said. "I have a wagon. Large one, designed for freight hauling. It's hidden about 2 miles south of here. I also have contacts in Lawrence who will provide shelter, no questions asked." "Why would you help us?" Ruth asked suspiciously. Brennan was quiet for a long moment. "Because my sister was married to a free black man in Illinois. They had 2 children. 3 years ago, she and her family were kidnapped by slave catchers who claimed her husband was a runaway and her children were therefore property. It was a lie. He had free papers going back 2 generations. But by the time the legal system sorted it out, my sister was dead from abuse she suffered on the plantation they'd been sold to, and her children had disappeared into the slave markets of New Orleans." He met their eyes, each in turn. "The law failed my family. I won't be part of the same system failing anyone else if I can prevent it." "One wagon can't move 300 people, Nathan pointed out. "No," Brennan agreed. "But it can move 50. Maybe 60 if people pack tight. The ones who'd be easiest to identify and recapture, children, women, anyone who stands out. The rest of you would need to scatter and take your chances on foot." It wasn't a perfect solution. It wasn't even a good solution. But it was better than anything else available. Delilah looked at Harlan. "What do you think?" "I think we're out of time to debate options," Harlan said, pointing to the eastern horizon where dust was rising from approaching riders. "Grayson's almost here." The next 30 minutes were controlled chaos. Delilah and Ruth organized the children, identifying those young enough to need help and old enough to stay quiet under stress. Pregnant women, nursing mothers, the elderly and infirm, anyone who would slow a group on foot or be easily identified and recaptured. Brennan led them south to where his wagon waited, a massive freight hauler with false sides that created hidden compartments. The children were loaded first, packed in tightly, warned that any sound could mean death for everyone. Then the women and elderly, filling every available space until 63 people had been concealed in a wagon that looked from the outside to be carrying nothing but ordinary freight. "There's a checkpoint on the road to Lawrence," Brennan said quietly. "Federal marshals enforcing the Fugitive Slave Act. I'll get you past it. I have documentation and a reputation as a reliable trader. But after that, you're on your own." "Thank you," Delilah said simply. "Whatever your reasons, thank you." Brennan nodded, climbed onto the wagon seat, and set off south at a pace that looked casual but covered ground quickly. Within minutes, the wagon had disappeared over the horizon. That left approximately 240 people who would need to scatter on foot and hope that darkness and determination would be enough to see them through. Harlan found himself standing with the group that had chosen to stay and fight if necessary, to buy time for the others. About 30 men, along with Delilah and a handful of women who'd refused to take shelter in the wagon. They were armed with rocks, with improvised clubs fashioned from tree branches, with farm tools they'd collected during their journey, against 30 men with rifles. They would last perhaps minutes. But minutes might be enough. Grayson's riders appeared on the eastern horizon at a full gallop, clearly past the point of pretending this was anything other than a manhunt. They rode straight toward Harlan's property, and Harlan could see Grayson at their head, his face set in lines of grim determination. The colonel reined in his horse 50 yards from where Harlan stood, the 30 fighters arrayed behind him. Grayson's eyes widened slightly at the sight of so many black faces openly visible, no longer hiding. "So," Grayson said quietly. "Here we are at last. Here we are, Harland agreed. That's a lot of property you're harboring, Mr. Harland. By my account, you're looking at violations of the Fugitive Slave Act sufficient to put you in prison for the rest of your natural life. These aren't property, Harland said. They're people. And I'm not harboring them. They're free to come and go as they please. Grayson's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. You understand I have to take them into custody. You understand we're not going to let that happen without a fight. You're outnumbered and outgunned. True, Delilah said, stepping forward. But you're not rounding up cattle, Colonel. You're trying to capture human beings who would rather die than go back. So the question becomes, how many of us are you willing to kill to enforce a law that treats people like property? It was a calculated gamble. Dead slaves had no value. Grayson's clients wanted their property returned alive and able to work. Mass slaughter would defeat the entire purpose of the recovery operation while creating a public relations nightmare that would echo through the increasingly hostile debate over slavery's future. Grayson seemed to recognize the trap. I don't want violence. Then leave, Harland said. Turn around and ride away. Let these people be. You know I can't do that. Can't or won't. Thunder rumbled in the west, and the first drops of rain began to fall. The weather was turning right on schedule. In another hour, the prairie would be soaked, visibility would drop, and tracking would become nearly impossible. I'm going to give you one chance, Grayson said. You all surrender peacefully, return to your lawful owners, and I guarantee no one will be harmed in the process. You resist, and my men have authorization to use whatever force necessary to effect the capture. Your force against our desperation, Big James said. Let's see how that mathematics works out. The rain began falling harder. Harland could see Grayson calculating, weighing his options. A fight here would be bloody in public, with witnesses who could testify to excessive force. It would complicate the legal proceedings, might even create sympathy for the fugitives among the increasingly powerful abolitionist movement. But if Grayson left empty-handed, his reputation would be destroyed. He'd be seen as the military officer who'd let 300 slaves slip through his fingers. The standoff stretched out, rain falling steadily now, turning the ground to mud. The riders shifted uncomfortably in their saddles, rifles ready but pointed skyward. The fighters stood their ground, armed with desperation and improvised weapons, ready to die if necessary. And then from the south, a voice called out, strong, clear, cutting through the sound of falling rain. Y'all having a party out here and didn't invite me. I'm hurt. Everyone turned. A woman stood on the horizon, small and slight, maybe 5 feet tall, dressed in clothes that could have belonged to either gender. She was black, middle-aged, with a face that suggested she'd seen everything the world had to throw at her and remained singularly unimpressed. Moses, Delilah breathed. The woman, the legendary conductor whose arrival they'd been waiting for, walked forward with the kind of confidence that suggested she owned every inch of ground she walked on. She carried a rifle with the ease of someone who knew exactly how to use it, and something in her eyes made even Colonel Grayson pause. Harriet Tubman, Grayson said slowly. There's a reward for your capture that would make me rich. There's been rewards for my capture for years, she replied. Yet here I stand, free as the day I was born. Curious how that works. She looked past him to the assembled fugitives. Y'all ready to move? I got a route cleared, safe houses waiting, and about 6 hours of good darkness once this storm settles in. But we need to leave now. You're not taking anyone anywhere, Grayson said. But there was uncertainty in his voice now. You going to stop me? Tubman asked. You and your 30 riders against me and my reputation. Because I guarantee you, Colonel, the moment you shoot me, you become the men who killed Harriet Tubman. Your name goes down in history alongside the worst villains of this whole ugly business. Is that really how you want to be remembered? The rain fell harder, and in the distance, thunder rolled across the prairie. Grayson sat on his horse, visibly torn between duty and self-preservation, between the law and the growing awareness that history was shifting beneath his feet. Finally, he spoke. I can't just let you walk away with 300 people. 240, Tubman corrected. The rest already gone. Safe by now, I'd wager. And you're not letting me do anything, Colonel. I'm doing it whether you like it or not. Only question is whether you're going to make this violent, or whether you're going to tell your clients that the group scattered before you could effect capture. One version makes you a monster. The other just makes you a man who got outmaneuvered. Your choice. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of rain hitting the ground. Every person there seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for Grayson's decision. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but clear. There are principles higher than property law. I may not agree with you, Miss Tubman, but I won't be the man who starts a war today. He turned to his riders. Mount up. These people scattered before we could establish positive identification. We return to Missouri and report accordingly. Some of his men looked like they wanted to object, but Grayson's authority held. They wheeled their horses and rode east, back toward Missouri and the lives they'd left to hunt human beings. Tubman watched them go, then turned to the assembled fugitives. Well, you coming, or you want to stand in the rain all day admiring the scenery? The journey north took 6 days, moving only at night, sheltering in safe houses and hidden camps that Tubman navigated with the confidence of someone who'd made this run dozens of times before. The group that had started as 12, grown to 300 through desperate accumulation, scattered under pressure, now reformed into a community of shared purpose. Harlan traveled with them, at least for the first 3 days. He told himself he was just seeing them to safety, making sure they reached free territory before turning back. But he knew he was lying to himself. There was no turning back, not to his isolated homestead, not to the life of deliberate neutrality he'd constructed. On the third night, as they sheltered in a barn owned by Quaker abolitionists in northeastern Kansas Territory, Delilah found him sitting alone, staring at nothing. "You're thinking about your property," she said. "I'm thinking about everything I've lost," he admitted. "My land, my isolation, my ability to pretend the world's problems weren't my concern." "You've lost those things," Delilah agreed. "But what have you gained?" Harlan looked at her, this impossible woman who'd walked into his life and destroyed every comfortable assumption he'd held. "I don't know yet." "You've gained a story," she said. "One you'll carry the rest of your life about the day you chose humanity over law, people over property. That has to be worth something." Maybe it was. Maybe in time, Harlan would believe that the trade had been worthwhile. For now, all he could feel was the weight of everything that had changed. The children from Brennan's wagon reunited with their families in Lawrence, having made it past the checkpoint exactly as Brennan had promised. The store owner himself disappeared shortly after, his role in the escape making it impossible for him to return to his business in Missouri. Rumor said he'd gone to California, started fresh where his past wouldn't follow. Harlan hoped it was true. Nathan decided to stay in Lawrence, where his blacksmith skills were in high demand among the Free State settlers preparing for what they were certain would be all-out war over Kansas's future. "I've run long enough," he told Harlan. "Time to stand and build something instead." Ruth and her family continued north with Tubman, heading for Canada, where they would truly be beyond the reach of slave catchers and fugitive slave laws. "I won't rest easy until I'm on British soil," she said, "where no American law can touch us." Big James simply vanished one night, slipping away from the group without explanation. Delilah said he'd done it before, the man was too recognizable to travel safely with others. He'd make his own way north, using methods he'd developed over years of helping others escape. She seemed confident he'd survive. Harlan wasn't so sure, but then again, he'd learned not to underestimate any of these people. Delilah herself reached Canada 6 weeks later, crossing the border at Detroit with a group of 17 souls she'd gathered during the final leg of the journey. She sent word back through the underground network, a message that eventually reached Harlan. She was working as a dockhand in Toronto, using her extraordinary height and strength to load ships. She'd found a community of other fugitives who'd made the same journey. She was, the message said, free. Harlan never returned to his homestead. He sent a letter to the land office formally abandoning his claim, then drifted east into Iowa Territory, where his face and name weren't known. He found work as a farmhand, then as a mill operator, slowly rebuilding a life from the wreckage of his carefully constructed isolation. But he was never isolated again. Not truly. The memory of those 14 days stayed with him, appearing in dreams and quiet moments. 300 faces. 300 stories. 300 souls who'd passed through his life and changed it irrevocably. He thought often about the choice he'd made, to give water to a desperate woman, to harbor fugitives despite the law, to risk everything for people he'd never met before. The old Harland would have called it foolish, an unnecessary entanglement in problems that weren't his concern. The new Harland understood that some problems become your concern the moment you acknowledge another person's humanity. That neutrality was a luxury only available to those whose lives weren't at stake. That sometimes the hardest choice was also the only choice a person could live with afterward. Years later, after the Civil War had come and gone, after slavery had been abolished and the nation struggled to rebuild itself from the ashes of its greatest moral failure, Harland would occasionally wonder what had become of all those people. Whether the children had grown up free, whether the families had stayed together or been scattered by the continuing upheavals of history, whether Delilah was still in Toronto or had ventured back south to build a life in the country that had once treated her as property. He never found out. The Underground Railroad kept no records, maintained no rosters. The people who'd traveled it disappeared into freedom like water seeping into earth, finding their own paths, building their own lives away from the systems that had sought to enslave them. But sometimes on quiet nights, Harland would look at the stars and imagine them scattered across the country, these souls he'd briefly sheltered, building homes, raising children, living the lives they'd risked everything to claim. And in those moments, he felt something he couldn't quite name. Not pride exactly, not satisfaction. Perhaps it was simply the recognition that he'd been part of something larger than himself. That for 14 days in the spring of 1857, he'd stood on the right side of history, even though he couldn't have known it at the time. That when the moment came to choose between safety and conscience, he'd chosen conscience. The choice had cost him everything he'd thought he valued, his isolation, his neutrality, his property, and peace. But it had given him something, too. A story that mattered. A moment when his life had meant something beyond his own survival. And in the end, perhaps that was enough. This mystery shows us that the hardest moral choices often come to us unbidden, finding us even when we've tried to escape them. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Harland made the right choice, or should he have protected his own safety first? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more stories that explore the darkest and most courageous moments of American history, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who appreciates these forgotten chapters. See you in the next video.